Hello, and welcome to another episode of Your Right to Know, brought to you by the Fitchburg Republican City Committee. I'm going to be your co-host today with my other co-host, Mary Lotze, as always. And we are going to be talking about what has occurred over the course of the discussion on Trump haters, where does the GOP stand, and where do we go from here? And our guest this evening is going to be somebody that needs no introduction, Dr. John Strang. John, you don't need any introductions. You're a recurring guest, but please, for our new listeners, briefly provide your background and education and why you're able to discuss different philosophical differences and provide a historical perspective to our topic.
Thank you. Well, I am a philosopher. My doctorate's in philosophy. I went to Boston University, prior to that to Albert Ludwigs Universität in Freiburg and Breisgau in Germany, and certain other schools. And I've taught philosophy, actually most phases of philosophy at various colleges and universities in New England. I'm now retired, but I'm still open to teach. With respect to the topic today, certainly political philosophy has been a major area of interest for me, but apart from that, I have a practical experience, history of connection with the Republican Party in Massachusetts for a number of years. While I have the opportunity, I'm going to be shamelessly self-promoting and show you a picture of a recent book I wrote. You can make this out, Beginning and End. This is a historical philosophical novel, just came out 2 months ago. It's the third in a series of novels I've written that are set in the late 18th, early 19th century in New Zealand and in Europe. And they offer a sort of a critique of the sentiment of the inevitability of democratic progress, but it goes beyond that because it's actually also focused on an area in philosophy called philosophy of history. And I'm presenting through these novels the position that, just to read from the quibs on the back of the book, the books argue against the assumption that modernity exhibits inevitable progress, and that on the contrary, the unfolding of time will reveal a regression of consciousness such that humanity will pass out of history and into myth. Anyway, that's enough for me. So let's move on with the actual topic of today's meeting, if you want.
So we're taping this show for January 2021, and we're taping in mid-December. And as of right now, we still don't know the outcome of the election. There are several questions and concerns, deep concerns about voter fraud, and also about the election outcomes that deserve to be discussed more and investigated. Several topics. Why is there such a visceral hatred and loathing of President Trump? Why we have a Trump election loss? And what do the Republicans and conservative voters do to ensure that the successes of the Trump years are not lost to a radical socialist agenda? And what will be the legacy of President Trump?
Okay, you want me to enter into the first of those, I guess, which is the issue of Trump hatred. Certainly it's not debatable that not just from the beginning of the Trump presidency, but before it, from the moment indeed he came down the escalator, there's been a tremendous evidence of dislike for Donald Trump and for the people who have voted for him. This raises the question, why? Why should there be such a level of loathing for this man? Why such an incapacity on the part of the people who don't like him actually to look at his record as opposed to what he says, because his speaking may be sometimes offensive, even to his adherents. I think it's a reflection ultimately of a mindset of the left. Now, we living here in Fitchburg in the middle of Massachusetts may not be acquainted with the presence of rabid left-wing ideologues, because they're not that common in our neck of the woods. But I lived in Boston for many years, and believe me, in Boston and in Cambridge, left-wing ideologues are much more common. You can go certain streets in Cambridge and find whole streetfuls of people who are rabidly unlike any ordinary American citizen you will ever meet. They hate America. They hate capitalism. They hate our history. They want all of these things replaced. Now, just a handful of people wouldn't be sufficient to bring about such ends, but they've been active for many years. They've affected our school system, our educational system, our notion of what it is to be a citizen. It's undergone such an incredible change in our lifetimes. I mean, think back to the 1960s, when in a sense this all really seriously began, this veering leftward. Now, as an historian of revolutions, among other things, I'm aware that this is not new. The notion that you would have a clique of people who are rabid ideologues, who despise everything about the society we inhabit, is something that we can trace back at least to the 18th century, to the French Revolution. No one is going to come forward and say that the French Revolution should never have come about. Certainly there were major problems in France in 1789 that compelled radical changes. But what happened and what was so surprising in 1789 was how quickly, once the actual revolution began, things changed. Remember, the French Revolution began actually as an answer to a fiscal problem. The French state could not finance itself, and it had to call into being an organization and a political institution that had not met for 175 years. One element of this institution was the commons, the third estate. And the third estate very rapidly took over the entire government and pushed through very radical policies. And what was distinctive about this, from our perspective, is that the brains behind this, the Jacobins, the Committee of Public Safety as they established themselves, quickly determined the contours of politics in France. France, over a period from 1789 to 1792, became progressively more left-wing. And the opportunities for those who were moderates became progressively more restricted. And what issued eventually was the outbreak of war. In the Russian Revolution, the same sort of thing happened. You had cliques of ideologues who despised Tsarist Russia, which had many bad things, but a few good things, and was determined to bring it down. And it was characteristic of both of these cliques, whether in the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, that the people who constituted these cells of ideologues were divorced from reality. They didn't look at the actual statistics of how people are doing. For example, the historian Richard Pipes, who's dead now, but was the major historian on the Russian Revolution, taught at Harvard, established that without fail, the ideologues of the Russian Revolution tried to portray the lot of the average wage earner in Russia, mostly peasants at this time, as getting year by year worse and worse and worse. Their economic situation got worse year by year by year. That's simply false. It was not borne out by any of the statistics.
Well, aren't we seeing some of the same thing now? We do have to kind of move along on our agenda, but we're kind of seeing the same thing now, because in our case now we have the mainstream media who refuse to promote or talk up any of the successes that President Trump had. And we'll talk about that in our third section when we talk about President Trump's legacy. But to listen to some of the Trump haters, and John, you and I certainly felt the wrath of many Trump haters as we would do some standouts and some supportive Trump things. And, we've oftentimes talked about it. We're not shy retiring violets, but if the left didn't have the F word to use or their middle finger to use, we got to the sense that they couldn't communicate, because when it came to President Trump, there was only one word and one gesture that was constantly used towards us, towards the president, towards the administration, and towards any successes. It was not just, oh, I dislike them, I dislike his policies. It was a hatred of the man itself. And I guess what you're saying is that it's a sort of an innate loathing.
Well, it certainly is a reflection of the attitudes of people who have been about this loathing for many, many years. When I first came to the area, to Boston in the mid 70s to work on my doctorate, I remember meeting at some meeting a man who taught at the University of Massachusetts. He was a Harvard graduate. And he was teaching history at the University of Massachusetts. His name was Charles Shively. And I was astonished at how much this guy hated America. There was nothing good in America as far as he was concerned. We have Howard Zinn. You've heard the name Howard Zinn. He was another American hater. He was not as violent in his hatred as Shively was. But Shively and Zinn are characteristic of a mindset of certain intellectuals. In this case, they taught at major universities in America, who influenced subsequent generations of teachers. And this went down the line into high school, teachers in high school. And the outcome has been a culture which is much more receptive to hating America than the culture we grew up in. There's no comparison. And so that from what seems to be a very narrow source has spread abroad through the corruption of our educational system and the corruption of officials, individuals in libraries, even librarians have been part of this hate America attitude. They probably would deny that, but all you have to do is look at their actual actions. You know, for example, American Library Association a few years ago refused to allow librarians from Cuba who had escaped Cuba to attend their meetings because they would have been critical of Fidel Castro. We have an image of teachers in schools, in colleges, of librarians. We have an image that is 60 years out of date. And the result is what we find around us today, a culture in which the intellectual basis has been corrupted. There is no opportunity. I was a teacher in college. There was limited opportunity for conservatives to address the student body. Anyone who was invited to address the student body was brought in by a committee, and this committee was made up exclusively of left-wingers. There was never any invitation extended.
We're losing our...
Anyway, I'll bring us to an end. The point is that our culture has been corrupted, beginning with intellectual corruption. And the result is what we've seen in the last 4 years, and God help us, what will be even more significant in the next 4 years if there is a Biden administration.
So let me go forward then and ask this, John, because it seems like in addition to the culture being corrupted, we're actually losing our constitutional rights. People may not understand this or respect what I just said, but we are losing our constitutional rights of freedom of speech, liberty, thought, all of this. The fact that we couldn't stand on a street corner without being verbally assaulted with vulgarity tells you that even our freedom of assembly right is being taken away. So let me just ask you, because I mean, we have to be realistic as Republicans, as conservatives. We have to be realistic that we're probably looking at a Biden presidency. With that said, as Republicans, as conservatives, what do? Do we just stand back and pretend that it's not happening? Do we just do what the Democrats did to President Trump and try to thwart and stop and halt every single thing that the new president does? Or what is the proper actions that we people who disagree with the philosophical leanings of the new president, what is the best course? What do we do?
I'll present my position by phrasing it this way. During the Munich 1938 agreement, when Hitler threatened war against Czechoslovakia, unless he got part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, there was a follow-up, an agreement on the part of the major leaders of Europe, including Chamberlain in England with Hitler and so on. And out of this came the so-called Munich Agreement. which had the effect of destroying the Czechoslovak state because it dismembered the German-speaking portion of it. And what was left was indefensible. Winston Churchill, who was not in government at that time, famously said, "This is an unmitigated disaster." He was very prescient. I say the same thing about the prospect of a Biden presidency. It's an unmitigated disaster. It's a disaster brought about by the active collusion of government officials in specific states, 6 critical states, where we have evidence that Trump was ahead, and suddenly the vote counting stopped. People were prevented from observing certain actions in the workplace, in the voting areas. And when voting was resumed, there was suddenly a surge of votes for Biden. Out of all probability, and I'm talking statistical probability as well as evidentiary, there was no way this could have happened. We have ample areas of evidence. Just today, today's December 14th, evidence came out that the Dominion software system, of which we've heard quite a bit in recent days, not only did cause problems, but was programmed to cause problems. It was programmed to cause errors. They had a 68% error rate when the legal limit is under 1%. Now, there's so many levels of evidence of this fraud that we would require several programs in which to actually expound on them. But what I'm saying is that you cannot get around the fact that a Biden presidency would come in under fraudulence, under sheer fraudulence. There's no way around this. It's not as if, and we've been given a lot of evidence of what leftists intend to do if they get power. It's not as if we're ignorant of this. We've heard them. We've heard people like Bozo O'Rourke, or I guess Beto O'Rourke, saying outright he wants to get rid of our right to bear arms. We've seen the behavior of the clique around Nancy Pelosi and what do they call themselves, the AOC's group?
The squad.
The squad, yeah. We know what they're going to do. The only issue is how quickly can they introduce this?
And
we're in the midst of an unmitigated disaster if Biden takes over.
We've seen through previous shows it can happen within a generation. It will happen very quickly once it starts. Andrew, you were going to say something because we also have to move on to 3.
Correct. So John, what do we do? Even if the Supreme Court won't pick up this case, what's the next step?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I have a theory, but I'll let you.
Okay.
I'll let you answer first.
There are a number of practical things we can do. One obvious thing is boycotting states and cities that engaged in this fraud. We know that Philadelphia did. We know that Detroit did. Milwaukee did. Certain other states, Nevada, in the case of Nevada, there was massive fraud there too. Conservatives, if you have the option of not visiting those places, that's certainly one thing you can refrain from doing. Another thing, we know the media has been collusive in all of this. There's ample evidence of that. So move away from them. If you have had the habit of looking at any of the major media outlets, don't look at them. Move away from them. I haven't looked at the Boston Globe in 50 years. I haven't bought a copy of it in 50 years because it was obvious to me 50 years ago that they were nothing but a liberal propaganda mill. With respect to social media, there are other social media which are coming on the scene, like Parler, for example. So you don't have to use social media, which we know are destructive of conservative ends and indeed censor conservatives. There are also possibilities of I'm trying to think of some of the names, like Newsmax or One America News. These, I think, have grown in popularity since the election. Beyond that, I'm not quite sure, because we have to think of the actual mindset of people who are willing to allow this fraudulence to take effect and actually to determine our course as a nation. What it really implies is that if we accept that, this means we are accepting the legitimacy of people who probably never had a majority of the votes, either electoral or popular votes, and they are willing to use fraud in order to secure power.
A means to an end.
Such an attitude, it's contradictory to our whole conception of what it is to be an American. You know, it's an affront to our American nationhood that we should accept such a thing.
I mean,
It's
Mary and I were
inconceivable.
discussing last night. She sent me it was a little snapshot of an article where the Supreme Court justices were actually terrified of taking on this case as to what could happen with the rioting, and they didn't want anything to do with it.
Right.
But my theory on the case is Texas filed. Okay, so Texas filed, and they said that they did not have standing,
Right.
and they kind of gave Trump the information that he needs for any of these other cases, the Georgia case, the Milwaukee case, the Pennsylvania case. Kind of gave him a roadmap on what to expect and what to do. That's my theory, because I don't think this is over yet.
Well, what would he do, Andrew? What would he do?
Eventually these cases are going to be hitting the Supreme Court again. They keep getting dismissed in lower courts, and they just keep appealing. It's going to get to the Supreme Court again.
That would be wonderful. The issue is the January 20th deadline. You know, what makes things difficult is the assumption that we can get all of these cases out of the way before then, and I don't think we can.
All we have to do is get an injunction to stop the inauguration until the fraud. And not to mention, Trump also did that the executive order in 2018,
Right.
saying that if there's any foreign influence, the election stops and it gets investigated.
Right.
Well, gentlemen, I have to say that we now have to start winding up our show. So I see that we will have to maybe continue this program on to our February show, and maybe we'll have more of a resolution. But I do want to maybe at that time talk about the Trump legacy, because I think we're missing the fact that President Trump was so successful on so many different aspects of what his administration touched. We think of the unemployment, we think of the economy, but there was the Abraham Accords. I mean, there's the peace in the Middle East, the withdrawal of troops. We can't end there. So thank you, John. And go buy his book. That sounds like a really interesting book. And as we leave you tonight, as we leave Your Right to Know, we thank you for sitting in with us and watching Your Right to Know. And we want you to know that we hold dear your constitutional rights and your values to be free citizens with liberty and prosperity for all. I would like to leave you with this one little reminder that we're kind of looking at now, and it's easy to be a communist in a free society. Try being free in a communist society. And I think that's where we're now going if the worst happens over the next several weeks. We thank you for joining us, and thank you, John and Andrew, and we will be with you next month. Happy 2021.